Hello, so in this video we're going to be going over a few things. First of which being the pioneers of editing when it was in its most infant form, and how their techniques have evolved cinema into something that was once nothing more than an extension of theatre, a simple attempt at amusing audiences, to the multi-billion-dollar beast it is today. And of course the types of editing that were used / how they were discovered, as well as how the audience size and their understanding of cinema has changed alongside editing. Now, starting off with early cinema, you've got Auguste and Louis Lumiere. Now, these two brothers created the first cinematic camera. Now, they still had all the static cameras that could take still shots and then view them later on, but this was the first device that would let them take moving images and either view them later on. You can connect it up to something called a magic lantern, and you could then project it, or you could print them out onto film. So while it was a huge advancement in terms of getting to where we are today with cinema, it didn't really progress any narrative on until George Méliès came along. Now, he tried to buy the original cinematograph off the Lumiere brothers, but they turned him down. So he went and made his own camera, his own production studio, and started making films. Now, while ignoring the horrifically disturbing moon, notice the cut. This was Méliès' magic trick that really wowed the audiences. This simple cut found accidentally became one of his greatest assets, in not only moving the concept of editing forward, but captivating the audience as well with new and exciting techniques. It was at this point that editing became a necessity for filmmaking, and Edwin Porter, who worked for the Thomas Edison Company, took the lead role in motion picture production, and he introduced cross-cutting and parallel narratives in his latest production of The Great Train Robbery. Now, you can see examples of this in pretty much any film nowadays. You'll notice it more obviously in films like Love Actually, where you have tons of different narratives going on all at the same time for a big crescendo at the end. D.W. Griffith later stepped on the scene with his two controversial films, Intolerance and more notably, Birth of a Nation. Not only were these two films both massively popular / controversial, but he introduced the classic cutting style. And to quote an article, this was the sequence of shots determined by a scene's dramatic and emotional emphasis, rather than physical action. And what this means is, rather than having a close-up just for the sake of it, it's to actually drive the plot forward and to make the audience perceive something that might not be there. He also started using continuity editing, and this was essentially trying to match two shots together from different angles, but continuing on the motion and the action. Now, this created more of an invisible editing style, and wasn't something that audience members picked up on straight away, but because of its simplicity, it was picked up relatively quickly, and is now something that we see in pretty much every film. So when we're saying how a close-up could actually portray meaning that isn't actually there without providing any additional content, this is more of a primitive version of the Kuleshov effect. Now, what the Kuleshov effect is a blank expressionless face following a selection of images. Now, Lev Kuleshov did this to prove that while the face stays the same, the order of which these scenes are shown changes how the audience perceives that original person. So look at the following video and notice how the tone very drastically changes depending on which scene you see beforehand. So as you can see, depending on which scene you saw beforehand, you would perceive that girl differently. So either as a bratty teenager, a happy newlywed, or a sad friend who's just found someone who'd committed suicide in front of them. Both Lev Kuleshov and his student, Sergei Eisenstein, were hailed as the two geniuses of cinematic evolution of their time. Eisenstein's most influential piece of work was Battleship Potemkin, a communism propaganda film that had international success. He also created the 5 methods of montage. These were metric, rhythmic, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual or ideological. Now what this allowed for was for films to use these methods of montage to try and portray different meanings depending on the types of shots there were. Now it's the final rule of montage, the intellectual or ideological method, that revolved around having abstract ideas from the media. And what this meant is that some films could pull it off amazingly well, like they did in Battleship Potemkin. Although during the second film, also done by Sergei Eisenstein, October 10 Days That Shook the World, there was far too many abstract ideas from this film that ran around 3 hours long, and it left the audience feeling confused throughout the entire film. So what does all this mean? Well, what all this leads up to is cinema as we see it today. It's the collection of being able to manipulate the audience by using the Kuleshov effect, by being able to use Soviet montages to create given effects, to be able to use jump cuts to portray action, and as well as invisible editing. It's all these things together that allow us to create what we know today as cinema. So going into the effects more, starting with the jump cut. As you know, this was created by Georges Méliès, but the reason it was accidentally found is when he was trying to film a bus go by, the tape messed up. So when he fixed it and started filming, when he put them together, he noticed it cut. So this was like a magic trick of it going invisible. It was after using these types of jump cuts after a while that he used a splicer to splice them together and eventually create his first film using a jump cut. Using a splicer, of course, meant it was all done in linear editing, and linear editing was where all the frames had to be together. You couldn't go back and change something if you needed to. Whereas nowadays we have non-linear editing, which is like your Final Cut Pro, your Adobe Premiere, and this will let you do whatever you want really. And this sort of approach was never really possible in those days. So all the stuff that wasn't possible 70, 80 years ago is possible now. And take for example James Cameron. He wanted to create the film Avatar, but the technology wasn't there at the time. So he waited until it was available, and now thanks to motion capture, green screen technology, and just really talented artists, they're able to create things that would just be alien to people like Georges Méliès. It's always great to see how far we've actually come. Take for example the 180-degree rule having to be present in any piece of media, where during all the silent films you'd have to have the camera on one side, something that the Georges Méliès had to do because his style was basically capturing the theatre, and it was only when Edwin Porter started to bring in his own narrative that the camera started to move a bit more. So the 180-degree rule is still used a lot in today's cinema, especially in TV more so. So in things like chat shows, quiz shows, football games, but you tend to see the 30-degree rule more often. And while the 30-degree rule does abide by the 180-degree rules, it's not as obvious. So just to wrap up, we've got Auguste and Louis Lumière, who created the cinematograph. We then had Georges Méliès, who's wanted to create his own work and accidentally invented the jump cut. Edwin Porter, who brought in his own narratives and introduced cross-cutting and parallel narratives. David Watt Griffith with his Birth of a Nation. Lev Kuleshov and his Kuleshov effect, which proved how the audience perception is changed depending on the footage displayed. You've got Eisenstein and his Soviet montages, and then the evolution of both equipment, styles, and artistic visions, really. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something from it.